It's starting. We are live. 3, 2, 1. This is Literary Roadhouse. One short story once a week. I'm Maya.
And I'm Anais. And Gerald is still on vacation. He's in France, uploading gorgeous pictures of boat graveyards and everything in France.
Why didn't he give us advance notice so that I could climb into his luggage and be smuggled across the UK? I'm so jealous of his vacation. For people that have been following, you guys know that we've had some amazing co-hosts during Gerald's vacation. Unfortunately, this week's co-host had computer difficulties. So this week, you get just the two of us. And I'm trying so hard not to start singing that song. It's right on the tip of my tongue. Oh, God, you're going to make me do it, aren't you?
I did it.
The two of us, you and I. Okay, so this week we are looking at, what is the name of the story? The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas by Ursula Le Guin. Take it away, Anais.
Okay, if you haven't read The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas yet and don't want to be spoiled, pause the podcast, read the story, come back. So the story takes place in the city of Omelas on the day of the festival of summer. It isn't really a story in the sense that it doesn't follow a character through a plot. Instead, the entire narrative is a description of the city of Omelas, a happy, prosperous city. It's a utopian society. But don't think of it as simple-minded agrarian folk with their sheep and barley. There's no king, there's no clergy, no stock exchange either. But there's washing machines, trains, and maybe even a cure for the common cold. The narrator isn't authoritative on the details of the city. The reader is invited to imagine the city however they so choose, as long as the city is prosperous, free, and happy. But there is one detail that you must include in your vision of Omelas. In a basement, a small child is imprisoned in a broom closet. They're malnourished, neglected, covered in boils, sometimes kicked, often gawked at. This one child must suffer so that thousands within the city may be happy. Every single citizen of Omelas knows about this child and are free to visit him or her, but cannot offer it any aid, not even a kind word. Many spectators leave in tears or a rage, brood on this child's condition for a while, but eventually come to the conclusion that the child cannot be helped. Thus, they content themselves to know that their happiness comes at the cost of this child's happiness and perform their duties with enthusiasm and care. But there are a few who see the child and are moved to silence. After a day or two, without a word to their families or any explanation, they leave north and west into the mountains, alone. Their destination is unknown.
I just have to say thank you so much for bringing the story to the Literary Roadhouse. I have not read any Ursula Le Guin since middle school. I read the Earthsea series because that's what we did in the 80s. Everybody was reading that series, and as a young nerdy kid, it was all about that series. And since then, I haven't really read anything else of hers. I haven't read any of her novels, and I've never read any of her short stories. And there are so many things about this short story that really struck me. The first being that this short story, it's classified as a short story, but it's really an allegory. And I remember reading one of Neil Gaiman's stories, the one about the star, and of course, I can't remember the name of it off the top of my head, but regardless, it's really a fairy tale. But I went into it expecting a novel. And because I was expecting a novel, it really let me down for the first half of the story until I realized it was a fairy tale. And then suddenly I was able to enjoy the story. This story, the very first sentence, adjusted my expectations and let me know that this was going to be a really soaring story. It wasn't going to be about plot and about character. It was going to be about something a lot bigger. And it allowed me to enjoy this story because she set my expectations right up front. How did you feel about this story?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. And so I've also read The Dispossessed by Ursula K. Le Guin, and it reminded me a lot of that story in many ways, especially when you're talking about soaring. When you say soaring, I'm thinking also of distance. She's very distant from what's happening, from the image she's painting in your mind. And it's kind of the same in The Dispossessed for most of it. There's a few sort of closely narrated scenes where it's very close to the characters, but a lot of it is five miles away looking down on this world, and it has the same sort of philosophical bent critique on society as this short story. And it's funny you mentioned that the first sentence sort of set for you your expectations. I actually had to read the first sentence about 5 times just to sort of figure out her rhythm. I had to remember, because she has a very specific rhythm to me, and I had to remember, okay, this is how Le Guin writes again. And it's beautiful once you get into her rhythm, but it's I think uncommon for the type of literature that I normally read. I don't encounter it often. So I like had to relearn Le Guin.
Yeah, there was something slightly old-fashioned about it, something very elegant about the language, both the words used and the construction of the words. And it was something that I enjoyed. But at the same time, the story wasn't convoluted. Like, it definitely has a moral. There's a lot of philosophy in the story, but it wasn't written in a way that was so into its own, like, philosophical, like, I want to say something, I'm trying to be clean. You know what I mean? It wasn't so much in its own head that you couldn't just embrace the story and enjoy the story. And it allowed you to get the moral and to really think about it. And this was a story that it started off so simply, and it set me on this spiral of philosophical thought that I wasn't expecting to have. And it reminded me of Roz Morris last week when we were talking about the definition of short story, because it's a story like this that really brings to mind what she was saying about short stories either changing the character or changing the reader. And I feel like this is one of those stories that changes the reader.
Yeah. Although I think when I was reading this, I was thinking of certain people who I know would probably disagree with not the thrust of her philosophy here, because I see it as a very naked moral. You don't have to dig too deep to get the gist of which way the narrator leans, politically speaking. So or you know what they're trying to say here. So I remember reading this and thinking it's really easy to get and it's really easy to reject if you're somebody who doesn't already come to this kind of predisposed to agree with what the moral is, because the moral is, some of it is very black and white, suffering, not suffering, and some of it's very political, which I think there you can have people who read it, get it, and are like, nope.
Well, I think because when I say moral, the moral could really be either way, really. And I think this is where we really need to get into the moral of the story, okay? Mm-hmm. Because you're looking at a situation where the happiness of the masses is dependent on the misery of one. That doesn't necessarily tell you which way is the right way. The fact that some people leave, that's their choice. They've made their choices. But I think this is a situation where the story does allow room for the reader to decide for themselves which is better, the happiness of the group at the expense of one, or whether that's not fair and that's morally wrong. You know, and I think that is a very old question that goes back, you know, as long as there have been wars and humans. For me, what it brought to mind was, you know, I after I read the story, I did a lot of research afterwards. I was like, okay, so this is an allegory. I finally understand why I was getting so, as I was reading it, I had a similar feeling to when I was reading about Plato's Cave, but I didn't really understand why I was getting that same sensation about the story until after I read it. I was like, oh, it's an allegory. I totally understand why I had that same feeling as I was reading it. And then after reading the story, I was thinking, okay, so the misery of one person allows the multitudes to enjoy a happy, peaceful society that doesn't have war, that has religion, but doesn't have priests. Everyone's happy. Nobody needs drugs. The one drug that there isn't addictive. Like, which is better? You know, is it so bad? And for me, it is, but that doesn't necessarily mean for everybody it is, because there are lots of people that would say, you know, if you could save thousands of people from death by killing one person, then that's a righteous act. And so, yeah, it made me do that kind of thinking. And then towards the end, there was a line that really, really got me, that dug into my gut and just ripped me out. It said, indeed, after so long, it would probably be wretched without walls about to protect it, and darkness for its eyes, and its own excrement its own excrement to sit in. And what it's saying is these people get to a point where they say, it's better, even if we could save this person, it wouldn't do any good because they're so used to their misery, they wouldn't be able to enjoy happiness. And you know what that reminded me of? the slaves are better off as slaves because they wouldn't know how to live in society without slavery. And at least they've got food and they've got shelter and they're cared for and they're just not capable of being on their own. And it just knocked me on my ass when I read that. I was like, wow, that is potent, because we have heard that argument. We've heard it with the Indians, with the Native Americans. We've heard it with slavery. We've heard it so many times for anyone, even going back to how the mentally ill were treated, you know, in the 1800s. There was very much a feeling that this is better than letting them have rights or freedom, because at least now they're taken care of. They wouldn't know what to do with their freedom if they had it. They would just get themselves in trouble. And it got me.
Yeah, that justification definitely stood out for me as well, along with it's sort of like little cancerous sister, which is like, but I understand their suffering, therefore my happiness isn't in vain. I'm self-aware. Like, I had that thing too where they were like, they're happy. It even said, there was a line, it was like, their happiness was not in vain. They understood the cost, so they can be better to their own children because another child somewhere else is suffering. And it had that sort of like the way that some people can justify their complacency with the suffering of others and can compartmentalize the parts that allows them to do what they want to do and not do what they don't want to do, the hard work of ending that suffering or saying no. So it kind of had both. It kind of, you know how people now there's all of those think pieces and blogs about slacktivism. It had a little bit of like that slacktivism thing going on where it was like, well, I know, so even if I'm not actually doing anything, I'm still somehow morally okay just because I know.
Yeah. And, you know, it's funny because in the beginning of the story, there was a line about, you know, she was constantly talking about how happy they were, but it wasn't a simple happiness. It wasn't like a pointless happiness, you know, that intellectuals only consider misery important, but happiness has many different shades. And, you know, there's a line where it says, but we do not say the words of cheer much anymore. All smiles have become archaic. And when I first read that, as I was going through the story the first time, to me, that sounded like they're so happy and they lack unhappiness to the point that they're not able to actually recognize their happiness, you know, because you need both emotions. You need to be unhappy to understand when you're happy. So if you're never unhappy, if you never have any suffering, if you never have any opposition, then happiness becomes empty. And that's what that meant to me. But then as I was reading the story, all of a sudden I remembered that line again. And coupled with the idea that they're not free either, it really brought to mind that even though they're all happy, because it depends on the unhappiness of one, it taints the happiness and it made them unable to fully express that happiness. And it took a dark turn for me right around in there. Right around in there, it took a really dark turn for me.
Yeah, I have that same thing highlighted, but I kind of had like a different sort of read on it, because like the story seemed to go between two voices, one being what's actually happening in the city of Omelas as they prepare for this festival, and as you're sort of watching nameless citizens go about their citizen things. And then there's like this like meta conversation between the narrator and the reader and us. That's kind of like, okay, we're gonna picture Omelas now. You can do this, you can't do that. Like I mean, it is very much a meta conversation, because she doesn't say there's orgies. She says, if you want orgies, you can put in orgies. If you don't, that's fine. You can have trains if you like. You know, like it's kind of like a, instead of a choose your own story, it's like a choose your own setting.
Yeah, exactly. I like that part when she did that with the drugs. That was funny.
Yeah, maybe there's drugs. It's called Drews. I'm like, cool. But, and that part I thought was in the very meta conversation where she's talking to the audience and she's like, I know that because I said they're happy, you guys are probably picturing like happy farmers, but it's because for some reason in this day and age, like this is narrator and audience saying, whenever we picture happy, we picture like simple-minded peasants. Why do we do that? You know, like I felt like it was like this great commentary. And she comes right out and says it with the line, the treason of the artist is the refusal to admit the banality of evil and the terrible boredom of pain, which I thought was a great line. And it's one that's been explored in other works. but here I feel like the artist she's talking about is an artist in Omelas. It's the artists who live among the audience, because it's like that meta conversation she's having with the reader.
Yeah. So I have a question for you. I mean, this is a very well-known author, and the story is written in an unusual way. Do you think you would enjoy this story just as much if it wasn't Ursula Le Guin? If it had a different name on the top?
I would. See, here's it's funny that
I heard the but. I heard the but.
There's a but there, because that question is niggling at me when it comes to rating Bradburys. It's like, remember how Todd last year, we always talk about our super fans. Todd's one of our super fans for new listeners. Yep. It was the Poe story, and he loves Edgar Allan Poe, and he goes 4 for Poe, 1 for the quality of the story. I feel like, am I giving it like extra points because it's Le Guin? Because I definitely would have liked it, for sure. But how much I would have liked it may be a little influenced by the fact that it's her and that I've read The Dispossessed. So it's like, oh, I see what you did there because I've seen you do it before.
Yeah. I'm trying to think right now. You know, for me, because I'm not instantly a fan of hers, I'm not a huge fan of Ursula Le Guin, I feel like I make a good proxy for this story. You know, this story definitely took a different type of reading. This story, it took close reading. I could have read it simply, but I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much. If I would have just read the story as it was, I would not have enjoyed this story as much. But by reading it line for line and allowing myself time to think on it and then go back and reread it, this is one of those stories that every time I read it, I got more out of it. By the way, it reads beautifully aloud too. I listened to it in audio as well. Beautifully aloud. And so I feel like this story holds up. Even if the story was written by a different author, I feel like it does hold up. I feel like you might, one of the problems is if it was by an unknown author, would you give it the time to get to that level of enjoyment though? Because I feel like sometimes we read authors and we don't necessarily give them the time to fully get out everything that's in it. And because we know who she is, kind of like when we read Alice Monroe, we know who she is, so we know there's something deeper in there. So then we do the work of the reader. How often do we actually do that work as readers?
Yeah, no, I agree. You brought up, I was thinking Alice Monroe as you said it, because I was like, I would not have given Alice Monroe the time if it wasn't, 1, that I had to read it for this podcast, and 2, that it's Alice Monroe. Because I was not sucked into that story. And this is one also that it took a couple paragraphs for me to really get sucked into it. And even then, I didn't appreciate it on the first reading anywhere near as much as on the second. And the things I appreciated about it isn't necessarily the bigger question of, is it okay to have one suffering for the masses that we already touched upon? But she has all these other juicy little nuggets of like insight into humanity and why things are the way that they are, that I think I enjoyed even more. And the more she kept hitting things that rang true for me, the more I liked the story. But you're right that if it wasn't Le Guin, I may not have given it enough time to get there.
Yeah. And I think this is one of those stories that makes me realize that this is one of, you know, when I wrote that article for Writers Fun Zone talking about how this podcast was changing how I read and how I write, this is what I mean. It's made me read closer in a way that, you know, I've read other books that told me to read closer, but, you know, sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. But having to read closer every single week, it's definitely changed me in that respect. And this story reminds me that when I do read an unknown author, when I do read someone who, you know, maybe on a passing glance I might not enjoy, maybe I need to slow down and do more of the work and take more responsibility as a reader, which is something nobody talks about. Who talks about responsibility as a reader, as a consumer of art? But you see that in paintings. Like when you take like an art appreciation class, it's all about history and schools, and you have to learn all this stuff in order to appreciate the art. You know, they don't just take you to a museum and say, look at art. Yeah, it's just totally different experience. What do you think for yourself? You know, we talked about the moral. What did you come away from the story?
Well, I wanted to get back to that because so you said an interesting thing a short while ago. You were saying how it, you know, it has the suffering of one versus the happiness of everyone else in the city, but it doesn't, you said it doesn't explicitly tell you how to feel about it. It doesn't explicitly tell you how to feel about it, but it kind of does implicitly tell you. Like there is this sort of niggling undertone to it that if you walk away saying like, that's a fair trade-off, that somehow, you know, like it without telling you you should want to be like the ones who walk away from Omelas, it's still kind of imparting that message in a subtle way that I think
Yeah.
kind of happens from the cleverness of her language and some of the other nuggets that come sort of with it. But it's kind of like there was this one line that I thought was so clever, just like craftily done, which was talking about the things that they do and don't have.
Yeah.
And after she's done saying that there's, you know, no monarchy or slavery, there's a line that says, as they did without monarchy and slavery, so they also got on without the stock exchange, the advertisement, the secret police, and the bomb. She doesn't say that the second comes from the first. She doesn't say that explicitly, but she draws a very loose line that you can't miss. You know, like she has this clever way of
it's definitely a political story. But if I'll be devil's advocate. Okay,
Yeah.
Many people think that if we were in a utopian society, we wouldn't need those things because those things are born of trying to create balance within a society. Okay. Yeah, we think that. But to someone with a different political leaning, they would see those things as goods. Those things not as bad things to have, but as those things are important to have. That a world without a stock exchange is a world that doesn't allow the free market and doesn't allow some people to rise to the top because of their talents, and that is morally bad. There are, all you have to do is read Atlas Shrugged.
Objectivism, that it's about the individual. Yeah,
exactly. And it's not that there are people, like large portions of, Americans within the Christian right movement that believe that that is not just a philosophical good, but a moral good. That becoming successful, making more money than other people shows that you are of higher morality. There are people that believe that. So for them, reading this story, they might have an entirely different take on whether or not, the good of the many is better or worse than, the misery of one, or whether this city that we look at as a utopia might not actually be a hell because it doesn't allow individuality. Like, how are you going to be an individual in the city?
Yeah. Well, so I guess there's like sort of like two things. One's the more like meta thing that I kept thinking of as you were saying that, which is I think people who think that the way that the individualism and all that kind of thing is the way to go, I still think they would read the story and know that it's criticizing them. That's what I'm saying. Like I'm saying, even though it isn't coming out and saying it, I think they'd know it. They wouldn't be changed. They wouldn't say, "Oh, you convinced me," story. I think they would be like, "No, those things are good. You should want the stock exchange and advertisement because it helps you push the, whatever that language is." I used to know it, but so
it's been a while since you were in school.
It's been a while. Yeah. Like basically the goods that are most productive and serve society the best should be advertised and pushed. But I still think they would read the story and they wouldn't be like, "Oh, the story is reaffirming my beliefs." I think they know that this story is coming at them from the opposite end. But I don't think the story is saying in a utopian society, you don't have technology. She very cleverly says that there is, but the type of technology that they have depends on that line she has, that happiness is based on a just discrimination of what is necessary, what is neither necessary nor destructive, and what is destructive. In the middle category, central heating, subway trains. And in the last category, she puts cars and helicopters. So she's basically saying there's some technology that this utopian society would never invent, and there's other that they would. That if it isn't destructive, but it's not necessary, it's fine because it's a luxury. You can have that. You can have the luxury of a subway train or the luxury of a washing machine, right? So I think she has a really interesting way in how you can allow yourself to have comfort and to invent certain technologies, and how some wouldn't be from the perspective of this society and its kind of like values.
Yeah. See, I have much lower faith in readers than that. I feel like for some people, they could very much read this story and say, see, this is what would happen if liberals got their way. This is what would happen. They would have all their utopia, but it would be all on the backs of some poor child. And, and I can see that, and I can see it just as much as someone that was like a socialist saying, see, if you sacrifice one thing, then it's for the greater good. And that's better than everyone living a sometime misery life, sometime happy life. Or someone that's kind of in the middle could read this as an allegory of the need to feel balance in the world. I feel like it's open-ended just enough that it makes you think. I feel like if she came at it more strongly from one side or the other, it would lose a lot of its impact because it would remove the ability to really think about it and consider how you are feeling about the story.
Yeah, it's good that we're having this. I'm not convinced still.
You don't need to be convinced.
We need to disagree. Yeah, but I guess what I'm saying, the reason why I don't think it's that open-ended is because the person who's suffering is an innocent child. Like, if she had made it a criminal or somebody who had done a wrong, then yeah, you could totally have sort of like the more right-wing side saying like, yeah, who cares about them? Which is something that even a lot of liberals could sympathize with, being like, yeah, who cares about the serial killer? But as soon as you make it an innocent child, it's a little bit like, clearly this is a wrong. Like, that's kind of universal enough that I think if you're reading that from the right side, you'd be like, no, we're not saying it should be on the back of some poor innocent child, right? Like,
but we do that. We may say that, but look at our actions in the world. We do it all the time.
Oh yeah.
How many innocent children die in wars and, whatever, in order to have the greater good of any particular society? Pick a country, any country. It's happened or it's happening currently.
Absolutely. I guess what I'm saying
is,
I'm just saying her commentary on that to me isn't unambiguous. Like, I
think it would have to be an innocent child. It would have to be, because it has to be so bad that it balances all the good in the city. And that's where I get to my feeling of balance and good and bad, hate and love. Like, everything comes in balance. If you're happy all the time, then you're never happy. And so in order to balance all these people having everything they want on one bad, that bad would have to be like super bad. And I think that's pretty much as bad as we can come up with. Like, can you think of anything worse than the wholesale torture and abandonment of a child for no other reason than to make sure everybody else is happy? I think given our current society, we really can't, because we have that whole cult of the child thing that's been going on since the Victorian era.
Yeah, so I think that's now going back into the balance of the world that she's building. So you're right that you need to have something be so horrible in order to balance that. I guess what I'm saying is, when you take it to the meta conversation, to the social commentary conversation in the world that we live in, I think if you're looking at this from the right side, I think a fair criticism of a right-wing person reading this is saying, you're making a straw man out of our end of this. Obviously, we're not here to abuse children. But I guess what I'm saying is, it's clearly a criticism on them. You could say unfairly. I think that's fair, but because it's so ludicrous. Like, obviously.
But is it ludicrous? Like, when I think about the history of the world and child labor, it really isn't so ludicrous.
No.
The Industrial Revolution was on the backs of women and children.
Right, but you're coming at this from a more liberal perspective. There's somebody on the right who would say
that children need to work.
It was a different time.
It teaches them work ethic.
Obviously, we're not going to do their side a lot of justice. I guess what I'm saying is,
we're trying though, when we're failing.
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is, if somebody on the right came over and said, "Hey, the way that the story is balancing it with all these happy people and then one miserable child is definitely not what we stand for," I'd be like, "True. Okay." They did make a straw man out of you. That is not.
That is exactly, and I would totally understand that argument as well.
Yeah,
I would. Although I have heard liberals talk about how, child labor isn't necessarily a bad thing. I mean, non-liberals, like I've heard it on TV and stuff, and there is an argument for it. So, I don't know. Like, I think the average, conservative that you would run into in the street would say this is a straw man making us look bad. But there is a portion.
Labor question. It's like, pure straight up abuse in the story.
Yeah,
So
but there is a portion of the group that would say, that might not make that argument.
yeah.
I don't know. It's a good
Yeah.
question. I mean, it tied my head up in knots, as I was thinking about it, because there's so many different ways that you can look at this story, both as a labor question, a slavery question, a war question. It really touches on a lot of really current topics to our society right now.
Actually, going to the war thing, one of my other favorite lines. I have a lot of favorite lines. This is why I don't know how many Bradburys to give it. When she mentions that there's no soldiers in Omela, she says, the joy built on the successful slaughter is not the right kind of joy. It is fearful. It is trivial.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
I like
deep.
that line.
It's a deep story. I really enjoyed it. And I think this is probably about that time, unless you have something else you want to talk about.
I don't know. I have so many little tidbits, but I think we hit the biggest ones. So there's all these little things to chew on. Even if you don't focus on the major story of is it okay to sacrifice one for thousands, then you have the question about soldiers, and you have the question about technology, and then there's a thing about
I love that throwaway line. We have religion, but no priests.
Yeah.
Ooh, that was loaded, and it was 3 words?
Mm-hmm.
It was so loaded.
And it came shortly after, if so, please add an orgy, which I had to circle 1,000 times. Okay. But then she tells you the rules for the orgy. Very important rules. You can't have it in a temple, okay? It just has to be people freely giving themselves, not like priests, not like young maidens who are forced into this, okay?
Okay, whatever. We got it. Okay. We're all good. Sure.
Orgy
on.
Yeah. Orgy the right way. There's a correct way and a wrong way.
Yeah, I mean that's what was so funny about the drug comment. She was like, and there was no drugs. No, because that might be puritanical. So of course there was a drug, but it's just not addicting and it causes you complete bliss. And I'm just cracking up the whole time.
But then she randomly throws in, which I thought was very for the time. She's like, and I guess for simpler taste, you can have beer. I'm like, yes. In 1975, did people think beer wasn't habit forming? They did know by then. We'd gone through prohibition because people knew. Beer, that's habit forming.
Oh my goodness. Yes, there were so many parts of the story that just, it really is a wonderful story. And for those of our listeners who have not read it, this is one of those stories I'm going to implore you, please, 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 please go read it, because it really is quite wonderful. But read it slowly and read it well.
And if we have readers who are more conservative in their political beliefs, I'd love to hear your reaction to it, because we're speculating and we could be way off base.
Yeah, I really think this story is a lot more open-ended than we give it credit for, but I may be totally wrong. I would like to think it's more open-ended than we give it credit for, and maybe just because we're so liberal, we can't see it.
It's possible that the reason why I don't think it's open-ended, why I think it's very clear where she stands, is because I read The Dispossessed, where it's very clear where she stands.
And it's also very clear where she stands. Everybody knows who she is as a person, the speeches she's given. If she was an unknown author who wrote this, maybe we would see it a little bit more open-ended. The fact is, I read it. I've read some certain things that she's said at the Penn Festival or whatever, but I haven't been deeply ingrained in who she is as a person politically or whatever. And I haven't read her other books. I read Wizard of Earthsea, and that was it. And so I'm coming at this from a perspective of not having that deep of an ingraining of her philosophical and political leaning, other than assuming she's probably kind of liberal because of what she said about Amazon. That's the extent of my understanding of her politics. And so for me, it feels more open-ended, but I don't know if that's just my hopeful thinking, because I do like a story that is a little bit balanced. And to me, there were positives to this world in addition to the negatives of this world. It wasn't all negative, but at the same time, I can see there's a lot of negatives to this world that she's driving home, but I didn't think it was all negative. I can see how someone can justify.
I recommend you read The Dispossessed, because in The Dispossessed, she kind of compares her utopia, which is anarchist syndicalism, which is the idea that there's no government and people can freely associate and create groups or not at their will. And so that's kind of her utopia. And then there's actually two utopias. I think it's called The Dispossessed, A Tale of Two Utopias. And then the other utopia is more like the free market capitalism that we're used to. And it's interesting how she compares and contrasts the pros and cons to both. She does give pros. Like, she's not like completely, I mean, she is like 5 steps left of Marx, but like she does give
5 steps up
due credit. Yes,
only 5 steps.
Only 5. But like she does give capitalism its due credit. And that comes through in the book. But despite all the pros that she gives it, because of the way that she thinks politically, she still comes down on, despite the cons that she finds in her own utopia, she's still like, I still think this is marginally better despite the cons, which is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of, I'm reading this story and I'm thinking, it was written in what, 73? So she was probably a young girl during the height of, Russia, and the Red Scare and all of that. And, reading Dostoevsky and a lot of those authors from that time, there was a sense that the good of the multitude outweighed the misery of just a couple people. Okay, so this one person doesn't get what they want, but that's okay because everybody else in the society has what they need. They have their food. They have enough money to live. They have their housing. So what? If there's a few political people that get shoved out into, the boonies and have to go to work camps, it's okay because as a group, society is working well, and I can see, I don't know. Like, what would I do? Like, what would I do if I had the option? If someone came down and said, you can have an ideal world, absolutely ideal, but there's going to be a couple people that are going to really, really suffer. But everybody else is going to be happy. It's going to be well adjusted. There's not going to be any war. There's not going to be any political strife. There's not going to be any religious strife. Like, what would you do?
Yeah. And that's one of those things where, like, I want to say that I'm going to be brave enough and noble enough and have enough integrity to be like, no, screw your false utopia. But at the end, push comes to shove, if I'm scrambling for my life, like that's what I want to say that I would say no matter what, back against the wall. But I don't know until I've lived through it. And I actually really quickly looked up Le Guin's age, because when you said she was a young girl, I'm like, I doubt it. Like, not to be mean, Le Guin, if you're listening, I say this with a lot of respect. She's not listening. But if she were, I mean, she's gotten on in age. She was born in 29. When she wrote the story, she was in her mid-40s.
Yeah, she would have been in her mid-40s. That was in 70s. So people, the height of the Red Scare was what, 40s and 50s?
I'm saying when she wrote the story, she was in her mid-40s. She was born in 1929. So by the mid-70s, yeah.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering how old she was during the height of the Red Scare.
I don't know.
See, that's what I'm saying. She probably, if we put the height of the Red Scare in the 40s, 29, so she would have been a teenager. Late teens, early 20s. So I'm sure that had a huge influence on her thought process and how she saw the world, which I find very interesting. Yeah.
She wasn't even around for the first Red Scare, and the second one, I'm in Wikipedia right now. I don't know this off the top of my head. Nobody should be that impressed. The second Red Scare was between 47 and 57.
Yeah.
So yeah.
20s. And I can definitely see that influence in the story. Definitely see the influence. Yeah. Okay, so what are you going to rate this puppy?
I am forever stuck. So when I read it the first
time, you too, huh?
I know. When I read it the first time, I was like, solid 5, maybe 4.5. Then I read it the second time, and I was like, 5.5. Am I gonna give it a 6 just because it's Le Guin? I shouldn't do that. I think it's gonna be a 5.5. The clouds did not part. I did not hear angels. Didn't give it
I'm giving it a 5.5 as well because I loved it. I loved the story. I loved how it made me think. I'm still thinking about it. I'm still not sure whether it's liberal or conservative, whether it's anti or pro. Like, I'm sorry. I'm still like on the fence. Like, philosophically,
I'm giving my oh please eyebrow raise.
Yeah, you're doing everything. Really? No, but I am like I'm really tossing these ideas around in my head, and for a story to stick with me like that and to really torture me that well, I think it deserves a 5.5. I'm not going to give it a 6 because it's not the type of story that okay, I can't recommend the story to just anybody. The story makes me do a lot of work as a reader, which I am very much pro. But I feel like for such an important philosophical question, it might be better if it was more easily accessible to the masses. Because if all the important works are so difficult to understand and require the reader to do so much work that few people do it, how much of an impact does the story really have? So I have to give it a 5.5 for lack of accessibility.
Yeah, and while I was thinking of the Bradburys, I discovered something about myself. I also felt a little uncomfortable giving 6 Bradburys to something that doesn't have a very traditional storytelling character pursues, X goal, faces obstacle. For some reason, the fact that it didn't fit that, I was like, can you really give a 6?
Are we going to end up with another Literary Roadhouse extras?
We are. This is already going into extras. How is it that this is going to be probably one of our longer podcasts and there's only 2 of us?
Because as many as we have heard before, prattle.
Yes. This is our slumber party.
But seriously, like, okay, if you're basing your Bradburys on what kind of structure a story has, you are locking out some of the major great experimental works from getting 6 Bradburys just because they're non-traditional. Well, that's just as bad as that podcast that I will not name with the co-host that I love to throw things at imaginarily in my head. I love him. If he was not on that podcast, I probably wouldn't even listen. He's my favorite person to disagree with. But that is as bad as him saying, well, this isn't a traditional story. He's probably one of those ethnic people that like everyone's holding up and it really should all be in English, or, you know, this isn't this isn't fiction because, you know, there's no like plot that leads directly, you know, to a change or whatever. It's just as bad as that to me. Like, you were locking out so many experimental forms.
I mean, I still gave this 5.5, and I still love it.
Just I know. I'm just want to argue with you.
I just felt like this weird niggling. I mean, in all likelihood, after I say this, I'm probably going to give it like my first 6 is going to be something experimental because it just grips me the right way. And then there's going to be like 1 or 2 attentive listeners who are going to be like, I thought you didn't do 6s to non-traditional story formats. True.
But here's what gets me about the traditional story format. The traditional story format is a white male format. You go to a lot of Asian countries, a lot of African countries, the traditional story format is not what we consider the traditional story format. So when someone says, I can't give this story a 6 because it's not a traditional story format, to me it brings in all kinds of politics of the fact that we've been inundated with Western literature rather than Eastern or African or some other forms of literature that aren't so hero's journey.
Yeah, no, that's fair. That's fair. And though it's interesting that a lot of non-white, non-male writers that even born and raised in other countries still do have a tendency to do that.
Mm-hmm, right now, because they're inundated with our literature too.
Exactly. That's what I was going to say.
Everybody is.
Despite that, yeah.
Remember, did you see the speech Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie gave talking about when she was a little girl and reading all of those stories, and then she was writing stories about little happy white children talking about the weather, and like nobody talks about the weather where she's at. Like exactly. Nobody drinks ginger beer where she's at, you know? Yeah, because they're inundated with our culture, and it's something I have to watch myself on a lot because I do it all the time, especially when like if I'm writing a book right now and I have a minority character and I forgot that I need to be really explicit about who he is because people will default him to white. Even if I say it just once, they will still default him to white because that's who the majority reads. And so even I am like, oh yeah, that's right. Like I have to remind people that he's not white because they'll forget.
Yeah. Though I was gonna say, though, when you think about like super, super old epic tales, when you think about like the Epic of Gilgamesh, or I'm blanking on the name. It was a Sumerian princess who wrote the first fiction story. It's like super short. But even those super old stories still had at their core a character pursuing something, right?
Well, yes, because that's where the basis of our Western story structure comes from.
Exactly. I guess what I'm saying is, I wonder if there's also something that's just sort of, because it seems like across civilizations, You can go as far back,
See, to
millennium
me,
BC.
when I look at Western culture, I don't see it beginning with white people. I see it beginning with Sumerians and the Bible and hero's journey. Like those were the original hero's journey stories. But when you read Native American stories, even if it has a hero's journey, a lot of times it's different. That there's something very different about the structure. Same thing with the African stories. It's really obvious in Asian stories. There might be a hero's journey, but there's so many branches and it tends to be more convoluted and it's done in a different way. So while I say like, yes, hero's journey, I probably does go across culture, but how the hero's journey is structured changes by culture. And Western culture's hero's journey traces back to the people that you were talking about.
Yeah. But I guess what I'm saying is like, even if you go back to like the earliest ancient Mayan myths or the ancient Incas, it's still, I mean, a lot of the characters like gods or animals, but it's still a character pursuing something. Right.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm wondering is I'm just kind of getting like just thinking out loud. Like I wonder if there's something about that that's just very human, even if
I think there's something about it that's very human. I think the structure of the hero's journey changes, but I think the hero's journey is always going to have some sort of pull. Yeah. Because if you think about the original storytellers, they were sitting around a fire just telling stories. And if you're telling stories in that way, as somebody who has done verbal storytelling before, if you're verbally storytelling and you don't have something written down and you're telling a new story, one of the easiest ways to tell a new story is to start out with a character and then throw in an obstacle. Have them overcome the obstacle, throw in another obstacle. And that is like at its most basic sense, that is the hero's journey.
Yeah. And I think that really cross-cutting. And I think coming back to when I was thinking about my Bradburys, there's a part of me that was like, you know, there isn't that. And for some reason, not that I need it, I still love the story and I don't think it needs it. But there's just a part of me that was like, how can my first 6 be that? And also, I think the other thing is I read this, and because for me, it's unambiguously liberal, I'm like, this is a really well-written, clever liberal screed. A little bit, just a little. So it's like, can I really give a 6 just like somebody who's like kind of like echoing my thoughts with this fictional, quote unquote, fictional society? You know, it's a little bit like.
That's funny. See, for me, I didn't need it to have that journey because what it did really well, you know, and there have always been stories that aren't the hero's journey. You know, this very much is an allegory, and that is one of the other ancient forms of stories. Mm-hmm. You know, it is like number 2, hero's journey and allegory, fairy tales, right up there. You know, we only have so many basic structures. And so, yeah, I loved it. And I don't think I've read a more modern allegory. Like all the allegories I've read are really old. I think this is the first modern allegory that I've read. I'm trying to think.
You mentioned Neil Gaiman earlier, and I know he's done some stuff like that.
This is a fairy tale. The one I was thinking of, which I still can't remember the name of that freaking book, and it's really popular. It's Star something, Starstruck, Stardust. Thank you. It was driving me crazy. That story is a hero's journey story that is also a fairy tale. Mm-hmm. It's not an allegory. Ocean at the End of the Lane is a hero's journey.
Fairy tale, yeah.
I don't consider it a fairy tale. I actually considered it much more of a novel. That's why I enjoyed it more, is because it felt more like a novel. It had fantasy elements. It was like a fantasy novel to me, whereas Stardust felt very fairy tale. And I think the difference for me is in fairy tales, the characters are very much, they aren't very complex. They tend to be archetypes. And a lot of the things that happen aren't really delve into very deeply. They tend to be symbols and very blatant. There isn't a lot of nuance in fairy tales when you read a fairy tale. And so Stardust felt like a fairy tale, whereas Ocean at the End of the Lane, it had a lot of nuance. There was a lot of depth of character, a lot of things that happened, even when they were fantastical. There were so much dimension that actually felt more like a fantasy novel to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like the way he did magic in that novel, but we're really getting away from this episode.
Oh yeah, we totally are.
Ocean at the End of the Lane has really cool magic, listeners. If you wanna go read it.
Oh yeah, amazing story. And so yeah, we've did that. And since we don't have a third person, we are going to skip the game this week because it seems kind of silly to have one person doing a game.
Mm-hmm.
Unless
they just run you through it for fun.
Oh, this is make
face.
Maya look like a fool in public with no payoff.
It's about pop culture. It's Australian actors and musicians.
Oh man, I was really looking forward to him because the guest that we were going to have he studies philosophy, and it was perfect. Urgh. So next week's story, I picked it from the Kenyon Review. We haven't picked anything from them, and they're a very well-known, well-respected literary journal. So I literally just went to their page and just picked a story because I really want to see what kind of fiction they are putting out, since they are so well-respected for modern literary fiction. And the story we're going to be reading is Sodom and Gomorrah by Adam McComber. And
I look forward to reading that. But in the meantime, we're not done discussing The Ones Who Walk Away from Omelas. You may not know it, but we keep on dissecting each week's story in the comment section on our website, literaryroadhouse.com. These conversations with listeners are getting deep. Join us. And while you're at it, leave an iTunes review and let us know what you think about the podcast. And as always, don't forget to tell your friends. Until next time, read a good story.
Ciao.